You open your phone and she's gone. Not just quiet, not just distant. Gone. No messages, no profile, no way to reach her. It's like you've been completely erased from her world overnight. And the first thing you feel isn't heartbreak. It's confusion, then frustration, then something deeper and more unsettling, a complete loss of control. You don't know what happened. You don't know what you did. And worst of all, you can't fix it. You can't even try. But here's what most men never understand in this moment. When a woman blocks you everywhere, it's not just an emotional reaction. It's about power. The entire dynamic shifts in an instant. And if you react the way most men do, you don't just lose her. You lose your psychological position, your perceived value, and any real chance of ever regaining your footing.
This is Liza from Secrets Inside the Mind, and today I'm walking you through exactly what being blocked everywhere actually means psychologically, what it reveals about the dynamic, what most men do that makes everything worse, and what the psychology actually requires from you right now. Engagement, CTA. Around 1 minute. If you've ever been in this situation, if you've ever opened your phone and felt that sudden erasure, comment the word blocked below right now. Be honest with yourself, because how you respond in the next few days will define what happens next. Subscribe right now because this video reveals the psychological truth most men never hear about this specific situation. Section 1. The psychology of being blocked. What actually just happened. Before anything else, you need to understand what being blocked actually means from a psychological perspective, because most men interpret it wrong from the very beginning, and that misinterpretation drives every mistake that follows. From a psychological standpoint, being blocked is not primarily an emotional event. It feels like one. It triggers hurt, confusion, and rejection, but beneath those emotions, something more structurally significant has occurred. A deliberate shift in access and control. Here's the psychological reality of what blocking represents. She has placed herself in a position where she controls whether, when, and how any future communication occurs. You are no longer part of that decision. You cannot reach her. You cannot explain yourself. You cannot influence how she feels. You cannot shape her perception of the situation. The access that made all of those things possible has been removed. By her, deliberately. In relationship psychology, the person who controls access controls the interaction. This is not a minor detail. It's the entire frame of the situation. And the moment that frame shifts, the moment she moves from participant in a mutual interaction to gatekeeper of whether interaction exists, you've moved from being inside the dynamic to standing outside of it. Here's what that shift looks like in your daily experience. You wake up and your first thought is checking whether you're still blocked. You scan your messages for any trace of change. You wonder if she's looked at your profile from another account. You feel your mood rise or fall based on a notification that never comes. Meanwhile, she's giving you nothing. No reaction, no engagement, no signal. That silence isn't empty, it's control. The more your attention pulls toward her, the more psychological power the dynamic gives her, and she's giving you nothing in return. Here's the uncomfortable psychological truth most men resist hearing. The person who can disconnect without hesitation is always in the stronger psychological position. Not because they don't feel anything, but because they're willing to act on it decisively. She acted, you didn't. And now you're in the reactive position. The position where your next move is determined by what she does, rather than by what you consciously choose. Understanding the psychological frame is essential because everything that follows depends on whether you see this situation clearly or whether you see it through the distorted lens of rejection and hurt. Section 2. The biggest mistake. What most men do next. Here's where most men lose everything. Not when they get blocked, but in what they do immediately afterward. Because the moment you feel that loss of control, every instinct you have activates around restoring it. And the way most men try to restore it is psychologically catastrophic. You want to fix it, you want to explain, you want her to understand your side, so you create another account, you text from a different number, you reach out through mutual friends, you show up somewhere she'll be. And in your mind, it feels completely justified. You're not chasing, you're trying to achieve clarity, you're trying to resolve something unfinished. But here's the psychological reality of what every one of those attempts communicates. You don't respect the boundary she deliberately set. And more critically, you cannot control yourself. That second message is not perceived as effort or caring. It's perceived as evidence of something specific. This man doesn't have the emotional discipline to accept a boundary that was clearly communicated. And from a psychological standpoint, that evidence is more damaging to attraction and respect than whatever originally caused the block. Here's the psychological principle that makes this so important. A woman doesn't permanently lose respect for a man because he made a mistake. She loses respect when he demonstrates that he has no emotional discipline after the mistake. The mistake itself is less significant than how he handles its consequences. Think about what your continued attempts actually communicate. You need her response to feel okay. You need her engagement to feel stable. You need access to her to manage your own emotional state. And those needs, visible in every additional message, every workaround, every indirect attempt to reach her, confirm exactly what she was likely already sensing before she blocked you. This man's psychological equilibrium depends on my engagement. That's not attractive. From a psychological standpoint, it's the specific quality that most reliably ends attraction permanently rather than temporarily. Here's the brutal psychological truth. You're not being rejected because you were wrong about everything. You're being rejected because you don't know when to stop. That's what separates a man she can respect from a man she needs to escape from. And every attempt to override her boundary reinforces which category you're in. Section 3. The honest psychological mirror. How you got here. Here's the part of this conversation that most men try to skip, because it's far more comfortable to focus on what she did than to honestly examine what you were doing before she did it. From a psychological standpoint, women rarely block without a building process that preceded it. By the time she cuts off all access completely, something has been accumulating, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, that you either didn't notice or chose not to address. Let me walk through the 3 most common psychological patterns that lead to being blocked, because recognizing yours is the only way to avoid repeating it. The first pattern is ignoring her withdrawal signals. She started pulling back, and you pushed through rather than creating space. Her texts got shorter, her energy dropped, her investment reduced, and instead of reading that information accurately and adjusting, you maintained or increased your level of engagement. Psychologically, pushing through withdrawal signals rather than creating space communicates that you don't read emotional information accurately, and a man who can't read emotional information accurately feels unsafe to be around at a psychological level. The second pattern is emotional dependency becoming visible. You became too available. Too centered on her, your emotional state started depending visibly on her responses. You needed more reassurance, more confirmation, more engagement than the natural rhythm of the connection generated on its own. And she started feeling that dependency in your interactions without you ever explicitly stating it. This is the pattern where nothing dramatic happened. No single event caused the block. But the accumulated weight of your emotional dependency slowly changed how she experienced being with you. The third pattern is crossing a line and not addressing it adequately. You said something careless, acted in a way that broke the emotional safety she felt with you, or repeatedly crossed a boundary she'd communicated. And instead of addressing it with genuine awareness and accountability, you minimized it, deflected it, or moved past it without really sitting with what she was communicating. Psychologically, having a line crossed and watching it get minimized doesn't just create hurt. It creates the specific psychological condition where cutting off access feels necessary for self-protection. Here's the psychologically honest reality. She didn't wake up one day and randomly decide to erase you. She slowly disconnected while you continued operating as though nothing was changing. It felt sudden to you because you weren't reading the process. For her, it was the conclusion of a process that had been underway for some time. And Here's why this honest examination matters more than anything else in this video. If you can't identify which of these patterns was yours, you will recreate the same psychological dynamic with someone else and reach the same ending. The block itself is not the problem you need to solve. The pattern that led to it is. Engagement CTA, around 12 minutes. If you're recognizing your own pattern in what I just described, comment below and be honest about which one it was. That honesty with yourself right now is the beginning of the only thing that actually changes your outcomes. Like this video and subscribe because the next sections reveal exactly what the psychology requires from you right now. Section 4, the counterintuitive psychological move. Block her back. Here's something that will feel completely wrong at first. And that's exactly why it's psychologically important. If she blocked you, block her back. Not out of anger, not as revenge, not as a childish attempt to demonstrate that you can do it too. You do it because right now you are standing outside a door, waiting for someone else to decide if you're allowed back in. And that position is costing you something more important than the relationship, your psychological self-possession. Here's the psychological reality of what happens when you leave that door open in your mind. You stay attached through possibility. You keep checking, not necessarily her profile, but the internal space where her decision lives. You keep wondering whether she'll unblock you. You keep running scenarios about what you'd say if she did, even if you never act on any of it. Your psychological attention is still fundamentally oriented toward her decision. That's not freedom. That's dependency wearing the costume of patience. From a psychological standpoint, blocking her back is not a move designed to affect her. It's a move designed to affect you. Here's what changes. Before, you're checking, waiting, monitoring a situation you cannot influence. Your mood rises and falls with a notification that may never come. After, there's nothing to check, nothing to wait for. No invisible thread pulling your attention back. The silence that once controlled you is replaced by a different kind of silence, one you chose rather than one imposed on you. That psychological difference is enormous. Here's the specific shift this creates. You move from being someone who is waiting for her to decide to being someone who made their own decision. That's not a small shift in circumstance, it's a fundamental shift in psychological positioning. And psychological positioning is everything in this situation. The moment you stop positioning yourself as someone who is waiting, you stop feeding the dynamic that gave her the upper hand in the first place. Control doesn't come from getting her attention back. It comes from genuinely no longer needing it. And you cannot manufacture that feeling of genuine non-need through willpower while leaving every channel of reaccess open and mentally checking them constantly. You close the loop. You step out of her frame and back into your own, not because it's a strategy to make her miss you, but because your own psychological grounding requires it. Section 5. Breaking the psychological cycle. Why you can't stop thinking about her. Even after you block her back, even after you stop reaching out, there's something still pulling you back toward her, and most men misidentify what that pull actually is. Here's the psychological truth. You're not necessarily still attached to her as a person. You're attached to the emotional cycle she created in you. The highs when she responded warmly, the uncertainty when she pulled back, the anticipation during silence, the relief when engagement resumed. That psychological pattern of reward followed by uncertainty followed by reward is neurologically conditioning. Your brain learned to seek the next signal. And when the signal source disappears completely, your brain doesn't just let go. It looks for the next hit. This is why you replay conversations. Why you wonder what she's doing, who she's with, whether she thinks about you. Why you find yourself checking her profile from a secondary account even after you told yourself you wouldn't. It's not weakness of character. It's the predictable neurological result of a specific type of emotional conditioning that intermittent engagement creates. Understanding this is psychologically important because it changes what the recovery work actually requires. You're not just getting over a person. You're breaking a neurological pattern. Here's what that requires practically. You remove the triggers deliberately rather than leaving recovery to chance. Delete the contact. Block on every platform. Remove reminders from your physical environment. Stop engaging with anything that pulls your attention back into her world. Her friends' profiles, the places you associate with her, the playlists or content connected to the time you spent together. Here's the psychological principle this serves. You don't leave detachment to willpower. You create environmental conditions that make detachment the default rather than the effort. And here's the psychologically honest challenge most men resist. You don't need closure from her to move forward. Closure is just another form of contact. It keeps you tied to the same psychological loop you're trying to exit. Real recovery starts when your attention is no longer fundamentally oriented around her world. That's when you actually begin rebuilding the psychological grounding you need. Section 6. The rebuild, what you should actually be doing right now. Here's where the psychological work that actually matters begins, not the work of getting her back. The work of becoming a man whose psychological foundation is solid enough that this specific situation, being blocked, losing access, experiencing the loss of control, doesn't collapse him. From a psychological standpoint, the question that matters most right now is not, will she come back? It's, what am I becoming in her absence? Because here's the psychological reality. If you spend the time she's gone mentally orbiting around her, checking for signs, hoping for signals, maintaining your emotional availability for her possible return, you're not using this time. You're wasting it. And worse, you're ensuring that even if she does return, you'll be in the same psychological position you were in before, the one that led to being blocked. But if you use this time to genuinely rebuild the qualities that were likely eroding before she blocked you, your discipline, your direction, your emotional groundedness, your investment in your own development, you create something genuinely different, not a performance designed to impress her if she comes back. A genuine internal shift that changes how you show up in every relationship going forward. This means your physical development gets real attention and consistent discipline. Your professional or creative work gets the focus it deserves. Your friendships get genuine investment rather than being neglected in favor of your emotional preoccupation with her. Your goals, the ones you had before this connection consumed your attention, get re-engaged. Here's the psychological truth about why this matters beyond the obvious. When you're genuinely engaged with building your own life, your emotional state stops being contingent on her situation. Your confidence stops being dependent on her engagement. Your sense of direction stops requiring her approval to feel real. And that shift, from a man whose psychological stability depends on her presence to a man whose psychological stability is internally grounded, is the only shift that actually changes your relational outcomes. Because the specific qualities that made you vulnerable to this situation, the emotional dependency, the overavailability, the visibility of your need for her engagement, all of them are symptoms of a man whose internal world isn't full enough to sustain his own grounding. The rebuild fixes the symptom by addressing the root. Section 7, if she unblocks you, the psychological test. Eventually, whether in days, weeks, or months, there may be a moment when you notice she's unblocked you, and this is the psychological test that reveals whether anything has actually changed. Here's what unblocking means from a psychological standpoint. She removed a barrier. That's all. It doesn't mean she's chosen you. It doesn't mean she's ready to reconnect. It doesn't mean whatever caused the block has been resolved. It means she made a specific technical decision to remove an access restriction. And what you do with that information reveals everything about your current psychological state. The average man, the one who hasn't done any of the internal work this video has been describing, sees the unblock and immediately feels that urgent pull to reestablish contact, to explain, to clear things up, to secure the opportunity before it disappears. And that urgency, that rushing toward the open door the moment it appears, communicates one thing with perfect clarity. You've been waiting here the entire time, and that communication destroys whatever psychological ground you might have rebuilt. Here's what the psychology actually requires. The first thing you do is nothing. Not because you're playing a game, but because a man who has genuinely rebuilt his own life and grounded his own psychological stability doesn't immediately drop everything because access was restored. His world didn't pause when she blocked him. It's not going to pause because she unblocked him either. You observe first. You let time pass. And then, if you choose to reach out, you do it from a specific psychological position. Calmness rather than urgency. Openness rather than pressure. Brief and genuine rather than explanatory and desperate. Something that communicates that your life has been full in her absence without announcing it. Something that opens space rather than filling it immediately, and then you watch how she responds. Because her response, her energy, her engagement level, her consistency tells you everything you need to know about whether this connection is worth rebuilding. Here's the psychological reality most men resist at this stage. If nothing about you genuinely changed during her absence, the outcome won't change either. You'll recreate the same dynamic, you'll produce the same ending. The unblock is not a second chance to do what you were already doing. It's an opportunity to demonstrate, not through words, but through the actual quality of your engagement, that something genuinely shifted. And if you can demonstrate that authentically, through genuine emotional groundedness, through genuine self-possession, through genuine absence of the desperate need for her validation that was visible before, then the reconnection has a genuine psychological foundation. If you can't, and you realize that in observing her response, then you've gained the most valuable thing this situation could give you, clarity about where you should actually be directing your energy. Final section, the psychological truth that changes everything. Here's where I want to bring everything together with the most honest psychological statement I can make about this entire situation. Getting blocked is not the end, but it is a moment of profound psychological truth. It reveals something specific, how you handle the complete loss of control over something you valued. And that revelation, your actual response to losing access, losing influence, losing the ability to shape how she perceives you, that's more important than anything else this situation involves. Because here's the psychological reality. There are men who get blocked and spiral. They chase. They create new accounts. They reach through mutual friends. They wait and hope. They maintain their emotional availability for a return that may never come. And slowly, across weeks or months of that spiral, they become someone they don't recognize. Someone whose entire psychological orientation is organized around a woman who removed herself from his life, and then there are men who get blocked and wake up. They step back, they look honestly at the patterns that led here. They take genuine accountability for what was their responsibility. They close every loop, practically and psychologically, and they redirect their energy toward building the internal foundation that this situation exposed as insufficient. The difference between these two responses is not the outcome with her. It's what happens to you in the process. Here's the final psychological paradox that this entire video has been building toward. The moment you genuinely become okay with the possibility of losing her, the moment your psychological stability is truly independent of whether she returns, is the precise moment your energy changes in a way that makes return possible if it was ever going to happen. Not because you're being strategic, not because you've manufactured the right impression, but because the energy of a man who genuinely doesn't need a specific outcome communicates itself without being announced. And that energy of genuine groundedness rather than performed indifference is what creates the psychological conditions where genuine reconnection could actually work. You don't regain power by getting her attention. You regain power by genuinely no longer needing it. And when that shift happens, not as a performance, but as the real consequence of genuine internal rebuilding, everything changes. Not necessarily with her, but with how you show up in your own life and in every relationship that follows. Comment, control below if something in this shifted how you see your own situation. Like this video, if it gave you genuine psychological clarity. Share it with a man who's currently spiraling after being blocked, because sometimes the truth is the only thing that actually sets you free. And subscribe to Secrets Inside the Mind, because this level of psychological honesty about power dynamics, about the patterns that lead to these situations, about what genuine recovery and genuine strength actually look like is what changes real outcomes. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.